What's going on, y'all? It's your boy Cool Colas here, and you are now tuning into a new video on my channel. But before we get on to the topic for today, I'd love it if you did a few things. Hit the like button, subscribe button, share button, and bell icon so you get notifications for whenever I come out with new content on this channel. And then when you are finished, leave me a comment below. That way I can get back to whatever it is that you had to say about today's topic. For today's topic, I want to talk about y'all's boy Jaleel White, and how he had some criticisms about how black people don't consider Family Matters a black show, and how we're inclined to just like shows that are hood. So let's get into it. Here's the thing, y'all. I like Family Matters. I really enjoyed watching Family Matters as a kid. I thought that a lot of parts of Family Matters actually were quite funny, you know. Family Matters is a show that I consider a black show. And a lot of people who I've talked to as well also felt like it was a black show as well, too. Actually, more often I would hear that Family Matters was a black show than I would hear that it was not a black show. But I think that Jaleel White is speaking about this in the context of this show kind of not presenting black people as a quote unquote monolith. And so I hear that a lot from black people who especially feel like they are not accepted by the black community because of the way that they may appear and they may show up. And a lot of times it'll be some brother who's interracially dating or somebody who is LGBT or something like that. And then they'll say black people are not a monolith. And it's not about any of that type of stuff. It's about what you do with that. So for example, a lot of y'all, will not just be interracially dating. You'll be swirling. You'll be talking about how black women have attitudes and that's why you don't want to go after them. Or, you kind of get down with some of the agendas of the white supremacists, and then you like to say that I'm not a monolith. So really, sometimes you all use that non-monolith gimmick in order to try to shield yourself from being open Sambo. And I mean, like, we just really need to be real about it. But when it comes to Jaleel White, he made the point that we do not consider Family Matters a black show. And I believe that this is just false. And as a black nerd myself, I would definitely understand how it feels to not necessarily be the expected presentation of a black person growing up. But even with that, I still believe that this is a black show, and I still disagree with his point. So let's go through a few things here. The first thing is, when it comes to Family Matters, the character Steve Urkel wasn't realistic. Steve Urkel wasn't a realistic black character. He was kind of a caricaturized black character, even as a nerd. When you think about the whole blurred culture thing, it's this idea of having a black person who is embracing and has assimilated to black culture, but also has a lot of nerdy interests and endeavors. So you may be in tune with black culture and everything that we like and do and how we behave and how our families raise us and how we grow up. But then we also just have interest in things such as anime or video games or whatever the case may be. You do have these bleaks out here, for example, who, are just geeks who just happen to just be black. But for the most part, a lot of us were just normal black people who just happen to have, certain interests and things like that. Steve Urkel just takes it to a whole nother level. I mean, this dude was flooding. I mean, this dude had a high-pitched ass voice. This dude was talking about, geez, please, and all this other shit. And it just wasn't really relatable. It wasn't stuff that we, even as black nerds, really did. And I think a lot of these other shows weren't really hood either. I mean, shows like Martin, I wouldn't consider that hood. Shows like Fresh Prince, I wouldn't consider that hood. Shows like Bernie Mac, I wouldn't consider that hood. Shows like The Cosby Show was definitely not hood. So I don't believe that what he is saying is something that is justifiable. I don't believe that we as a majority were not claiming Family Matters. Now, again, there may have been some of us who have said that it wasn't relatable, or it may not have been as relatable as some of these other shows, but we never said that it wasn't a black show. And obviously I don't want to speak for all black people, but just as a collective, I don't tend to hear people saying that it wasn't one. And I will affirm too that I have always considered it a black show. But I think what we need to get into is the part about how it's not as relatable as some of these other black shows. I think there was a specific target audience that they were trying to go after when it came to Family Matters. First of all, the show had white writers, so essentially they were making a show that was almost geared towards kids, or at least a family show in a family aesthetic. So they weren't really tapping on a lot of cultural black moments like you saw in some of these other shows, like for example, like in Fresh Prince. But at the same time, I think the whole goal was to make it very kid friendly. And even some of the themes were actually kind of kiddie as well too, which is why you had this nerd character who for almost every season outside of the one where he actually got her was chasing this girl who had absolutely no interest in him. You know, most people would move on at a certain point, you know? So I think that, you know, shows like that don't portray something that's very realistic to the way that we live, the way that we behave, the way that we function. I don't really think that it's for some people it was relatable in that regard. But again, I want to make it clear. I thought this show was good. I thought this show was funny, and it is still a show. It still is a show that I hold in high esteem. I just don't believe that it has the same cultural accolades that some of these other shows have, or relatability. This show almost kind of reminds me of the Kevin Hart of black sitcoms from the 90s, you know, in the 2000s even. And the reason why I say that is because there was a point where Kevin Hart, I found him to be pretty funny, especially in the beginning of his career. But then towards the end, it kind of tapered off, and like, you know, it became a thing of it was clear that he was appealing to, you know, white people who were buying into him. They were buying into this little dude who, you know, was like, you know, talking a mile a minute and doing little funny actions and bucking his eyes and all types of shit like that. So, you know, it kind of got into that type of thing. So what I mean by that is there are funny parts of it, but after a while it got to be too much. And I feel like Family Matters kind of has that same vibe. Like there were parts that were funny, and there were parts where it was like, this is a show that just has black people in it, but isn't necessarily the most relatable. If I had to pinpoint the real problem, I think that there's a bit of simulacrum, as I talked about before, kind of going on here, that I also talked about in the Jennifer Lewis video. And I think what happens sometimes is you have a person who plays a character and they're really, to a certain extent, playing themselves. Like they're actually being themselves in that character. And I can just tell by the things that Jaleel White says and does and the way he behaves and things like that, that there's a lot of black nerd in him as well too. But that's not the part that I think is the issue here. I think the issue is that he's a guy who, like his Steve Urkel character, is fighting and talking and clasping for straws like he is losing and he's already won. We respect Jaleel White. We've held him in high esteem. We've appreciated the work that he's done. We appreciate the Steve Urkel. We appreciate the Sonic the Hedgehog character that he voiced. So we have always held him in high esteem. But I think that Jaleel feels like he maybe doesn't have the best attention from the black community. Steve Urkel was a lot like Jaleel White in the idea that he thought that he was losing because he wasn't able to get Laura. Yet he had Myra all over him. He was chasing this broad who was not thinking anything about him, and to be quite honest with you, was less attractive than the woman he got. I mean, think about it. Myra was beautiful. She was feminine. And I mean, overall, she was just like madly in love with this dude. She wanted this dude because of who he was. She accepted him for who he was. As a matter of fact, she was mad if he tried to be anybody else but himself. So he had already won and he didn't realize it. And he believed that he was losing because he couldn't get Laura. When you look at Jaleel White, he believes that he's losing because he thinks the black community doesn't hold him or his accomplishments in high esteem or in an acceptable esteem to be accepted in the black community, when he already won because we have always respected the stuff that he has done. And I've seen this a lot with people who date interracially, where there's a low-key insecurity, like they feel like the black community has disowned them and we're really not checking for them, because he kind of was on that. Alfonso Ribeiro was on that as well too. Tamara was on that as well too. And I think, well, let's be real, the problem there was that she had a suspected white supremacist zaddy. So let's be real, that really was what the issue was and why she was getting dogged. But going back though, I think that a lot of times when some of these brothers or sisters interracially date, they have this insecurity like we just don't accept them anymore when we're not really thinking anything about them. And they blame a lot of things on the black community not seeing things a certain way. Now, again, I want to make it clear, there are a lot of us in the community who did not accept black nerds back in the day. That was 100% a thing. But for the subject and what we're talking about right now, I think that what Jaleel White is saying is that he's looking at one problem, and he's looking at the situation in a way that is maybe like deviating from what the real problem is. So for example, what I think the problem is that he got typecasted, and as a result, a lot of the opportunities that he would have gotten in Hollywood were depleted because of the fact that every time they see him, they're like, oh yeah, that's Urkel. And it did, a number on him. It was doing stuff to his voice, and it probably did something to his psyche that he wasn't really getting gigs and he couldn't really come up out of that role and whatnot. So I think that hurt him. And I think he believed that maybe there were some other opportunities that he should have been able to leverage if everybody held him in such high esteem, which I can understand. But I think that also what he's missing is that we don't really control anything. It's the dominant society who controls media and controls these images. And they wanted you to be this kind of slapstick character. And they kind of pegged you into all of that. But I think he was hoping that the support of the black community would lead him to other opportunities. And let's be real, there were a lot of barriers that were just kind of like getting broken, around that time as well too. I mean, you had like these kind of like fantastical elements that were going on because you had him going in the chamber, and then at one point he was Stefan Urkel, and he was like the smooth kind of like FBA dude. And you had a time where he went into the time machine, or the little machine or whatever it was called, and then he came out, and then he was Bruce Lee or whatever the case may be. So I mean, there was a lot of like I said, whimsical fantasy, almost science fiction like elements that were in this show. And I see that as both a good and a bad thing, and I think a lot of us recognize that. I think that it wasn't even the issue of there being that in the show, but more so the fact that it already wasn't relatable or culturally iconic the way that some of these other shows were, and in the way that how they were well balanced. Because the reality is that a lot of these other shows were well balanced, that when they started adding these other elements in there, it just kind of went along with the slapstick humor and the kind of maybe unrelatability, but I wouldn't say that, the fact that they had these elements was necessarily a bad thing. It was just, something that made it stand out and was different, that I think people probably weren't as used to, which is why, again, it wasn't really as relatable. But these other shows, like I said, were not hood shows. They were just very well balanced, with Fresh Prince being at the tip top of that whole well-balanced thing. Because think about it, I mean, he was in a mansion in Bel Air. I mean, and then you have other shows like Cosby Show that was, they were in a pretty well-to-do area. They were a well-to-do family. You had Bernie Mac. He had a pretty nice, cool middle-class family and all this other stuff. So I'm just saying, like, I liked Family Matters. I thought that it was a good show. I thought that Jaleel White was a good actor, and I respect the work that he has done. But I think that to say that we don't see this show as a black show is just not true, because we always have, and we still respect it for what it was. As a matter of fact, I'll be real, I still put it in my top 5. Y'all may not, and I understand it, but the point is that it shows you the way that we still view this man and his accomplishments in high esteem, or the way that we view the show. But feel free to let me know your thoughts below. Other than that, I hope you all enjoyed the video. I hope you all enjoyed what I had to say, and I'll definitely have more to come. Make sure that you stay tuned. Other than that, I'll talk to y'all later. Peace.